Well, good evening. It's so good to see all of you. I want to begin actually by quoting a proverb, not a proverb in the Bible, but an Arab proverb, and it goes something like this. It says, "He that knows not and knows not that he knows not, he is a fool. Shun him." The idea of the person who doesn't know but doesn't know that he doesn't know. He thinks he knows but doesn't know that he doesn't know. Just leave him alone. It goes on to say, this parable describes four types of people. So the second type of person, he that knows not and knows that he knows not, he's simple. Teach him. He that knows and knows not that he knows, he is asleep. Wake him. And the fourth person, he that knows and knows that he knows, he is a wise man. Follow him. The reason why I bring that up is because it seems whenever you look throughout human history, everybody wants to be wise. I mean, if you just look at human literature, and that didn't make any sense, as if there's dolphin literature. When you look at literature throughout human history, what you see is you'll see proverbs every now and then. You'll see a lot of proverbs, people talking about how to obtain wisdom. Aristotle is the one who said, knowing thyself is the beginning of wisdom. I don't agree with him, but he's talking about how to obtain wisdom. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about wisdom this evening. And if we're going to talk about wisdom, you probably already know the book of the Bible that we are going to go to. We're going to be in the book of Proverbs this evening, Proverbs chapter 1 in particular. And we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 1. And like I said, we're going to learn a little bit about wisdom this evening. And I'm going to break this lesson up into 3 points. I want to talk about the goal of wisdom. I want to talk about the foundation of wisdom. And I want to talk about the warning of wisdom. So the goal, the foundation, and the warning. We will begin with the goal of wisdom. And really, the goal of wisdom, why should I seek after wisdom? What can wisdom do for me? Really, the goal of wisdom is multifaceted. There are a number of different things, and so we'll just go over a few of them in the lesson. First of all, we should seek after wisdom because if we obtain wisdom, it helps us to build good character. Wisdom builds good character. Look at Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And then what Solomon goes on to do for a good chunk of the next little bit of the chapter is he says, this is what it's all for. This is what it can do for you. This is what wisdom can do for you. And so you'll see at the beginning of these verses, my translation will say for. It will begin with for. Your translation might say something like in order to or something along those lines. But what do these proverbs do? What does wisdom do? It is for learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding and insightful saying, for receiving prudent instruction in righteousness, justice, and integrity, for teaching shrewdness to the inexperienced, knowledge and discretion to a young man. And so if we think about some of the nouns that we saw, just looking at these first couple of verses, some things that wisdom can do for us, well, it can give us discipline. It can teach us how to be, look at these nouns in verse 3, righteousness, justice, and integrity. What these words are describing is these words are describing a person with great character. I mean, this is the type of the person that we want to be. We want to be described in this way. We certainly don't want to be described in like the opposite way. We don't want people to look at us and say, well, that Reuben, he is unrighteous. No one wants to hear that. Or that Reuben, he is unjust, or he lacks integrity. No one wants to be described in that way. We all want to be righteous in our dealings with other people and righteous in our dealings with God. We all want to be just in our dealings with other people, and we all want to act with integrity. And so what Solomon says is that's what wisdom can do for you. Wisdom can help you build a good character. But that's not the only thing. That's not the only sort of goal that wisdom has. Wisdom doesn't only help build good character, but it also helps build good thinking. Look at verse 2 again. Verse 2, if you look at the end of the verse, he talks about wisdom for learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding insightful sayings. The idea of understanding insightful sayings is being a good thinker, being able to discern God's will through these sayings. But it continues on in verse 6. Verse 6 begins with that for again. This is what wisdom is for understanding a proverb or a parable, the words of the wise and their riddles. And so what wisdom can help us become is wisdom can help us become good thinkers. And that's a good thing because God's people should be good thinkers. God's people should have good minds. I mean, think about what Paul tells the Roman brethren, what Paul tells the Roman Christians in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. He says, don't be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. And so God's people are not just people with good character. We should be people with good character, but we are people with good minds. We are good thinkers so that we can discern God's will. We should be able to read the Proverbs and understand the will of God. We should be able to read the prophets and understand the will of God. But that's what wisdom helps us with. Wisdom helps us to be able to do that. And so wisdom, it helps us to build good character. It helps us to build good thinking. But that's not the only thing wisdom has as its goal. Let's jump down to verse 8 of Proverbs 1. Verse 8, here Solomon, it seems, is speaking directly to his son. And he says, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't reject your mother's teaching. For they, and he's talking about wisdom here. He says, your father and mother have wisdom for you. But look at verse 9, the way he describes this wisdom, this teaching, this instruction. It says, they will be a garland of favor on your head, like this wreath around you. They will be pendants around your neck. In other words, what Solomon is trying to tell his son is wisdom will make you beautiful. Wisdom will make you attractive. Wisdom will make you the type of person that other people actually want to be around. And I think that's such an important lesson for us as Christians because Jesus certainly does say that the world will hate you. Jesus says that in the Gospel of John. The world hated me. And so, Jesus says, the world will hate you too. But that is not the only image of the Christian community that we get in the New Testament. When we look at the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2, we see the church being established, the early church. And once we get to the last part of Acts 2, what we see is the early church and the things that they started to do. It really is a model for us in our community. But in Acts 2 and verse 46, Luke records, every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and this is important here, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And so what we see is Christians aren't it's not as simple as, well, Christians are just going to be hated. Well, that's certainly going to be true at times. But what we see here in Acts 2 with the early church is that Christians enjoyed the favor of the community around them. Why? Well, because wisdom makes you beautiful. Wisdom makes you the type of person, I want to be around that person. Think about, again, righteousness, justice, integrity. Whenever you think about politicians and their political ads, that is what they want you to believe about them. I am just, I have integrity, something along those lines. Wisdom makes you attractive, makes you beautiful, makes other people want to be around you. And again, don't get me wrong, there are people who are going to hate us if we speak the truth. Just by speaking the truth, there will be people who hate us, but the world should not hate us because we are hateful or arrogant. Does that make sense? Christians are wise. That should make us attractive to others around us. That should help us to enjoy the favor of the community around us. And so the goal of wisdom is, well, wisdom helps us to build good character, to build good thinking, and it helps us to be attractive. That's the goal. Let's talk a little bit about the foundation of wisdom. Go to verse 7, please. Verse 7, this will be a quick point. The longest point will be the third point. And so if you've grabbed an outline and you saw it's shorter, then you're like, oh, we're going to get out of here early. Well, we might, but, we might not. Proverbs 1, verse 7. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. And so what we see is that wisdom begins with the fear of God. And when we think about the fear of God, it shouldn't mean, at least not for God's people, but the fear of God for God's people should not mean like the dread of God. Oh no, God is here. What's he going to do to me? God's people shouldn't feel that way in the presence of their God. That is, if you think about it, that's the way Adam and Eve felt after they sinned. But that is not the way God's people should feel just in general. When it's talking about the fear of the Lord, it is talking about being open to God and his will. It is talking about humbling ourselves before God and his will. This is what another proverb says, Proverbs 15 and verse 33. It reads, "The fear of the Lord is what wisdom teaches, and humility comes before honor." The idea being the fear of the Lord. It is tied to humility. And so humbling ourselves before God is really where wisdom begins. And that just makes sense, doesn't it? That makes sense. God's wisdom is sort of upside down from our own. We live in this upside down kingdom. And so the way God thinks and the way God rules the world is not necessarily the way we think and not necessarily the way we would rule the world. And so what we've got to do is we've got to set our own sort of presuppositions aside. We've got to set our own, well, this is what I've always thought. We've got to set that aside and sort of with a blank slate, go to God's word and learn what God has to say to us. Paul talks a little bit about this, about how God's wisdom is so different from the way that we think. He talks a little bit about this in the book of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, in verse 18, I'm going to just read a chunk of this here. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18, it says, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved." And so here what Paul is saying is there are people who are not going to understand what God is doing. The word of the cross itself, dying on the cross as a king, that is foolishness to some people. But then Paul continues on in verse 19 of 1 Corinthians 1. "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. I will set aside the intelligence of the intelligent. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolish?" Again, the idea, God does not think the way that we think. In verse 22, it says, "For Jews ask for a sign, and the Greeks seek wisdom." They are looking after wisdom. Again, wisdom is something people have searched for throughout human history. But he goes on to say, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks," foolishness to the Gentiles. The idea of they're seeking after wisdom, but God's wisdom doesn't make sense to them. Down in verse 25, Paul goes on to say, he says, "God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." And so God's wisdom is very upside down to us. Sometimes it seems foolish to us. And so what we've got to do is we've got to go to God with this humble state, essentially saying, "God, I know nothing, and I want you to teach me wisdom." And so if we want wisdom, it begins with God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And look, that makes sense. If you want to read Shakespeare, you know what you have to do first? You have to learn your ABCs. That's simple, but you get the point, right? If you want to do calculus, you know what you have to do first? Basic addition. If you want to be wise, you have to humble yourself before God. You've got to crucify your old way of thinking. That's what we all have to do. C.S. Lewis says this in one of his books. C.S. Lewis says, "In God you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people, and of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you." That's the idea. We've got to humble ourselves before we will really be able to see God's wisdom. Aristotle, I mentioned this earlier, Aristotle said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. It's like wisdom revolves around us. That's what Aristotle is thinking. But it's not so. Knowing God is the beginning of all wisdom. And so the foundation of our wisdom is in God. It's in humbling ourselves before God. But one more thing we're going to look at, and that is the warning of wisdom. And so we're going to be around verse 10 down to verse 19. By the time you get to this section of Proverbs, you're kind of bought in. And so you've been reading up to this point. If you've started in Proverbs 1 and verse 1, you've been reading up to this point, and Solomon has said, look, wisdom will make you beautiful. It will turn you into a person of great character. It will turn you into a great thinker. It is something that you need. It is something that God's people need. And so by this point in the text, we're like, okay, Solomon will give us the wisdom. I'm ready for it. I want to know the wisdom of God. And so this is what Solomon says. Okay, here we are. If you're ready for God's wisdom, here it is. Here it is, verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. If they say, come with us, let's set an ambush and kill someone. Let's attack some innocent person just for fun. And then Solomon eventually goes down to verse 15 and say, yeah, don't do that. And so this grand wisdom that Solomon has from God for us, that will make us wiser, smarter, people of great character. This grand wisdom that Solomon has for us is don't join a gang. Don't participate in drive-by shootings. That's essentially the wisdom that Solomon is laying out. This is where Solomon begins as he speaks on God's wisdom. But why? Why does Solomon speak about this first? So again, this grand wisdom of God, don't be murderers. Well, let's continue reading. I think the context will help us. We'll pick up at verse 10 and just go all the way down to verse 19. The text says, my son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. If they say, come with us, let's set an ambush and kill someone. Let's attack some innocent person just for fun. Verse 12, let's swallow them alive like Sheol, whole, like those who go down to the pit. We'll find all kinds of valuable property and fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot with us and we'll all share the loot. And so that's what he's laying. Look, if people tell you to do this, he goes on to say in verse 15, my son, don't travel that road with them or set foot on their path. He says, look, son, don't travel down that path. That is the path that leads to murder. Verse 16, because their feet run towards evil and they hurry to shed blood. It is useless to spread a net where any bird can see it, but they set an ambush to kill themselves. They attack their own lives. And verse 19, here's the key. Such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. It takes the lives of all those who receive it. And so I believe this last verse is the key to understand where Solomon is going. He tells his son, here's the grand wisdom of God. He says, don't be a murderer. Don't go in and attack someone unprovoked. And if I'm Solomon's son, and I would imagine Solomon's son is thinking along these lines of, okay, thanks, Dad. I will make sure not to murder anybody today. I will make sure not to walk down that path today. I mean, just think about it. How many people really struggle with murder? I'm not saying that those people don't exist. They certainly do, but I doubt it's anyone here in this building, unless you're one of those drivers. You never know. You might be one of those drivers who are threatening death to every other driver on the road. If you've ever experienced that, you don't have to come forward. But how many of us are like, yeah, I'm super tempted by murder, by walking down that path? For most of us, for all of us, honestly, it's probably not so. And so that's likely what Solomon's son is thinking. Well, thanks for that, Dad. I wasn't planning on murdering anyone today. But Solomon goes on to say, well, son, you're missing the point. You're missing the point. Solomon goes on to say, there's more to murder than just murder. He says, yes, I don't want you to, he says it in verse 15, don't walk down that road. Don't walk down the path of murder. But look at what he says in verse 19. Such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. And so the law of Moses says, do not murder. That's one of the 10 commandments. Don't murder. But Solomon's point is, if you have wisdom, you will be able to apply that further. Solomon says, you see, there are people who find success by stepping on others. There are people who find success by putting down others. And you know what path they're on? They're on the same path as the murderer. But Solomon is saying, but it takes wisdom to get there. Because the law doesn't necessarily say that. You have to discern that. It takes wisdom to get there. And so what is the warning of wisdom? The warning of wisdom is we can know all of the rules, but if we don't have wisdom, we might still not understand God's will. That's the warning. We might know all of the rules, but if we don't have wisdom, then we will still not understand God's will. Because the reality is, the Bible is not simply a book of rules, and we don't have rules for every scenario in our life. If we did, the Bible would just fill the entire earth full of pages. We just don't. And so there are certain things that the law is not going to cover that wisdom must cover. Let me give you an example of this. In Proverbs 27 and verse 14, the Proverbs writer says, if one blesses his neighbor, it starts off so well. Someone is blessing their neighbor. They're saying, oh, this is a great thing. Proverbs 27:14. If one blesses his neighbor with a loud voice early in the morning, it will be counted as a curse to him. You know, there's nowhere in the law that talks about that. There's nowhere in the law of Moses that says, hey, you probably shouldn't wake up your neighbor early in the morning before they've had their coffee. But the wisdom literature says, hey, look, maybe that's not the wisest thing to do. Maybe you just wait for them to have had their coffee in the morning and then go and talk to them. You see, the law is not going to cover every scenario in life. That's where wisdom has to come in. And so that's what Solomon is doing. Solomon wants his son to see, he wants us to see that murder is more than just murder. It's similar to the point Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount, if you remember, in Matthew 5. Matthew 5, in verse 21, where Jesus says, you have heard it was said, this is the rule, let me give you some wisdom. Matthew 5 and verse 21, Jesus says this, he says, you have heard it was said to our ancestors, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. He says, look, he says, yes, if you murder, you're walking down a path. If you murder, you're walking down this path of murder, and you will be subject to judgment. But if you are angry with your brother, you're walking down the same path. You're subject to the same judgment. He goes on to say, whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, you fool, will be subject to hellfire. Again, Jesus is making the same point that Solomon made. There's more to murder than just murder. If I'm willing to put other people down so that I can find some success, then I'm walking down the path of the murderer. If I'm willing to rip someone off so that I can be profitable, then I'm walking down the path of the murderer. You know, it's interesting, back during COVID, everyone was building computers and stuff because everything was going virtual. And so I built a new computer for recording and doing, because if you guys remember, we were doing sermons, but sometimes we were just doing sermons from our homes, me, Max, and David. And so I built a new computer, and at that time, computer parts were just all out of stock. And so you could buy them on eBay, but if you tried to buy them on eBay, they would be like twice the price. And so I was looking at computer hardware, and I found one at Best Buy that was in stock. It was in stock for like 2 minutes, and I was one of the lucky people who got it from Best Buy at MSRP. And I was looking at the prices on eBay. I was like, this was an $800 part for a computer. And I was like, this is selling for $1,600 on eBay. I'm thinking about just selling it. And my good wife, my beautiful wife, she was like, but wouldn't that be immoral? She was right. If I'm willing to rip someone off for my own personal gain, I'm walking down the path of murder. And that's what Solomon wants his son to see. And that's what Jesus wants the people around him to see. There were people in Jesus' day who may have known all the rules. They didn't have wisdom, though. There were people during Jesus' day. Jesus says, you have heard it was said, do not commit adultery. Well, that's fine. I'm not committing adultery, but I'll look at all of these women. As long as they're not my neighbor's wife, it's okay. And Jesus says, you've missed the point. Here's some wisdom. But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You see, there's more to adultery than adultery. But it takes wisdom. It takes wisdom to figure that out. And so, what's the point? It's vital for a Christian to have wisdom. It's extremely important. We can have everything else, and if we don't have wisdom, we'll just ruin things. If I have love but not wisdom, I'm going to hurt people with good intentions. I'm going to go to them with the best of intentions and just say the wrong thing because I don't know how to apply the love. If I have courage but not wisdom, I'm going to courageously blunder things because I don't have the wisdom to do it. If I have truth but not wisdom, then I'll make the gospel look ugly to people. because I won't know how to communicate it. If I have technology but not wisdom, then I will use the best communication ever invented in the history of mankind to broadcast stupidity. We need wisdom as a part of our life. You know, there was a famous scientist. He was actually a close friend of Albert Einstein. His name was Max Born, and this is what he said. He said this, and soon after he died. But he said, "I'd be happier if we had scientists with less brains and more wisdom." We need wisdom as God's people. But where does it begin? It begins by humbling ourselves before God's throne. That's where it begins. And so I hope this lesson has helped us all out to learn a little bit more about wisdom, learn a little bit more about discerning God's will, which is necessary. Again, the law doesn't cover everything, and so we need God's wisdom. Maybe there's someone here this evening who wants to take that first step towards wisdom. Do you remember what it needs? The beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord. It begins with humbling ourselves before the throne of God. And maybe there's someone this evening who wants to do just that. They want to humble themselves before the throne of God. They want to be baptized into Christ Jesus, raised to live an entirely new person. We'd love to help you with that. Or maybe there's someone who's left the Lord and you want to return to him. We'd love to help you with that as well. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can do so right now as we stand and as we sing.
Why keep Jesus waiting?